AJ Jolivet is going to teach us how to download podcasts.
Through podcasts, it gives people a voice that they didn't have access to before.
Mm-hmm.
Luckily, getting access to those voices is really, really straightforward. There's lots of different third-party programs you can utilize. There's websites you can utilize to download and listen to podcasts. I'm going to go over the base method, which is where podcast came from, iTunes, which is very straightforward. You have iTunes on Windows and you have iTunes on a Mac. Let's start with iTunes. So all you have to do first is you just open up iTunes. If you've used iTunes before, you haven't used iTunes before, if you're on a PC, you can download iTunes. It doesn't cost you anything. If you're on a Mac, you already have iTunes on there more than likely. You don't actually need an Apple ID to actually listen to podcasts. But
no way. I didn't know that.
You don't. You can listen to podcasts in any way, shape, form you want. And when you look at iTunes, on your top left menu, you got music, movies, TV shows, podcasts, iTunes, apps, tunes. You simply just choose podcasts. Now you have three options. You have library, unplayed, and store. If you've never used a podcast before, you won't have anything in your library. You won't have anything that's unplayed. You click on store, and it'll show you tons of podcasts. It's just like the iTunes store, which you've seen before, or just like a website where you're going shopping. There's just categories and lists of podcasts.
And by the way, if you're in there and you love TV, you can go on to AfterBuzz TV.
Oh yeah.
And find all of our AfterBuzz shows. Scandal or Grey's Anatomy, Game of Thrones, whatever your favorite show is, we do an after show at AfterBuzz TV. So you can start by downloading AfterBuzz. But what happens on the cell phone? Because I'm looking on here and I don't see podcasts on the cell phone version of iTunes.
You can download the app. So
okay,
just
on your computer you go to iTunes. On your phone you'd have to go to
the
download the
app.
podcast, which I have, of course.
Right. So you open up the podcast app, and it looks very similar to the iTunes version of the podcast. You can search and find a podcast you like. Plus, there's that little menu of podcasts or things that you can listen to that you like. Once you see them, though, that still doesn't let you download them. So you have a couple options when you find podcasts. You can either subscribe, which most people are going to really want you to subscribe to their channel, and that's great if you have a channel. That's great to support them, especially if it's something you love. That support keeps it going. So by all means, support anything that you love or that you like or you think you may like.
It's kind of like supporting free speech, to be honest.
It very much so is.
Because all of us who create podcasts are doing it so that we don't have to be doing or kind of pushing everyone else's agenda.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right.
So podcasts are really special for that reason.
Yeah, and there's so much great content there. No matter what you're into, you'll find something. So you can subscribe, and then you'll automatically get those new releases of those podcasts. Or when you look at the list of podcasts, there'll be a whole list of all the ones that are there recently for that particular channel. On the right-hand side, you'll see an option called Get. If you hit that, it will download that particular one. On the
but
left,
otherwise, it just automatically downloads.
Yes. If you don't subscribe. If you don't subscribe, you can just get one particular episode, right? You just download that one. Or let's say you don't want to download anything, you just want to listen. You also can just choose play, and then it'll start the streaming process. And then you just listen and consume, but you don't have to retain.
Yeah, so if you're in your car and you're using your Bluetooth, you can listen to your podcast through your Bluetooth.
That's right. You can just listen to it. Those are both iPhone and Apple type products. Your PC, iTunes works for your PC too. But on your Android phone, there isn't a podcast app by Apple, but there are different programs you can use. Stitcher, which everyone is usually familiar with Stitcher. Overcast, which costs money. Pocket Cast, which costs money. And then Podcatcher. These are all Podcatcher apps. And you can just buy some different ones. And then the process is essentially the same. Yeah. So Stitcher's a great alternative if you have an Android device. And then listen away. By all means, go find a podcast that you love and start listening and consuming.
Guys, this is why I love AJ Jolivet.